Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be with you, General McChrystal, and all of you today on Veterans Day. I couldn't think of a more fitting place to be today. I want to start by just getting your thoughts on some of the current events that have been going, because I know you have some thoughts, and you write about some of your political thoughts or your thoughts on the current political environment on character. But here in Chicago, I think the big story has been these aggressive deportation efforts. And what's striking about them has been the imagery that's come out of this. We have men and women in uniform here marching down city streets, masked with long guns. It feels like a militarization of the city, and it feels like a military occupation, even though that's not what this is. So how do you reflect on what you've seen, the images you've seen coming out of here?
Yeah, Paris, thanks so much. And I'm going to do what they taught me in media training. I'm going to ignore the question.
Don't answer the question.
And just say whatever I want. Paris and I have done this before, so it's been a real pleasure to be here. But I do want to say a couple things. First, one of the things we will get to talk about today is character. And to a certain degree, we're like preaching to the choir. The fact that the people in this room have the kind of backgrounds you have and the kind of commitment that you've already demonstrated, you know each other, it almost seems unnecessary. But what is necessary is we talk about character, and we talk about it at the dinner table. We talk about it at church. We talk about it at school. We exemplify that till we get a national conversation on character, because that, I think, is desperately needed. And so I would ask everybody up front, if there's success out of this, is you'll walk out and you won't have right answers on character. You say, you need to think about this. When do you talk about it? And we go from there. The second thing is there's always a risk if somebody writes a book on character that they send the message that I have figured it out, that I am an example of great character. And I haven't figured it out, and I'm not an example of great character, period. I am 71 years old, and so I've had a lot of time to think about it, and particularly the last 15 years, I've had a lot of time to focus on character in a way that I just didn't do before. I wish I had. And I don't think I've got any answers, but I think I've identified some good questions. And so I urge people to look at the questions that I've taken on and come up with your own as well and explore it. Because for me, there was a real catharsis to examining what I really thought about character and who I am and who I wanted to be. And so that's my bank shot to get to Paris's great question about what are we seeing on the streets. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what does America want to be? Who do we want to be? If we go back to the Revolution and the Founding Fathers, after the Revolution, they produced the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. There are a couple of places in the Bill of Rights where they insinuate that we don't want soldiers in the streets. The Second Amendment actually, depending upon how you interpret it, is designed to say we don't want to be oppressed by people who have weapons when we don't. And then, of course, the Quartering Act, the idea that it is illegal to take troops and make them live in people's houses, was a response to what the Redcoats had done, primarily in Boston and other places during the Revolution. We decided that we wanted to be a country that could defend itself, but we were not going to be, at our heart and soul, a militaristic nation. You know, we are enamored with Sparta. You know, ever since the movie 300, when I was young, an earlier movie. The Spartans were extraordinary soldiers, but they weren't very nice people. They, in fact, would do these raids at night against their own slaves, called helots, just to keep the slaves terrified, to keep them in submission. And I would urge us to think about, okay, what do we want America to be and look and feel like? Do we want to walk on the streets and see people dressed not just like soldiers, but like commandos? Is that what we want? Do we want to feel a little nervous when somebody stops and asks us for our papers. We want fellow Americans to feel that way. I would say that when we make decisions to put American military, even the National Guard, on the streets, and there are times when it's absolutely appropriate, natural disasters, times when we can help, even a pandemic, it's right to do that. But if we are doing it other times, we better have thought out the second and third order effects. Because those longer term effects, what are our kids going to think? How are they going to look at the military? What will be the tone of a conversation like this 30 years from now if we have a generation of young people who grow up to fear people in uniform? It'll be hard to generate enthusiasm for entering the military or for taking care of veterans, because they can easily find themselves depicted very differently. So my great concern is, and I understand the need for public safety, and law and order is very, very important to me, but I think we need to step back and decide what role we want the military to have and how we want it to be viewed.
And I appreciate you getting to the question and answering and avoiding the media training. And that kind of dovetails to my next question, because we see the current defense secretary, or as he would like to be called, Secretary of War, he had called the military leaders from around the world to a speech that he gave. And you know, there were different euphemisms out of it. Instead of service before self, we heard the euphemism FAFO, and we heard talk about overweight service members and facial hair. And I'm just curious how you might have reacted if you had been called from your post of command and you were in that crowd that day.
You don't want to respond emotionally to something like that. I don't think I would have appreciated it at the time, but first off, I'd say it was a huge missed opportunity. We've never called all the flag officers together before like that, so it was a big deal. It became a big news story just by doing it. I think if the secretary, followed by the president, had gotten up and given very thoughtful look at strategy, or the situation in the world, the strategy that we will need, the modernization that's critical, then I think a lot of us would have gone, whoa, this is serious stuff. These are serious people thinking about the defense of the nation. And it was important and appropriate to bring those leaders together so you get eyeball to eyeball to do that. I think the mistake was they missed that opportunity. And instead, what happened was some things that were talked about, you know, fat generals or facial hair, whatever it is, that different themes, it sounded like they were actually spouting those themes for different constituencies, people watching on TV, not people in the room. And so this is serious business. We are in a very dangerous world right now. We should not be spending our time worried about very small problems in defense. We should be thinking about great big problems in defense. And we should not be saying that certain people, like transgender people, can't serve. We need everybody who has the inclination and the ability to serve to have that opportunity to do that. The last comment I'd make, it because it's related to this, there have been a number of general officers or flag officers who've been removed from key jobs over the last few months. There is nothing wrong with firing flag officers. If they are incompetent, if they misbehave, if they do anything like that, have at them. And it happens. And that's important. But never in American history have we fired senior leaders for political reasons. The effect there is significant. We have a norm in the United States where the military is apolitical. In my career, I never knew the political interests of any of my peers. We didn't talk about it. It just wasn't considered appropriate. But the norm said that the military would have that ethos if the civilians would avoid politicizing the military. And so those two had to be in balance. If we destroy that, I can tell you from my experience around the world, I believe you will start to end up with a politicized military. You will get something you don't want. And it'll be really hard to fix over time. Because once you change the culture of an organization, it is fundamentally different. And so we are stewards as Americans of the critical parts of our government, the military being the one I'm most familiar with, and we've got to be very careful with it.
And that leads me to one more current events question before we dig into the book. Being stewards of the military and being careful with what you do with it. I think today there were reports that the British government is going to stop sharing intelligence with the United States because of some of these quote-unquote lethal kinetic strikes that the Department of War has undertaken just off the coast of Venezuela on these suspected drug-running boats. And I think some of the justification for this has been the same justification to strike terror cells. These are terrorists, they're bringing drugs to the country. But there's certainly a lot of controversy and a lot of questions around the legality. So what are your concerns when you see the now dozen or so of these strikes on these boats where we really don't have exact answers in terms of who we've taken out?
Yeah, I am not qualified. I'm not privy to the intelligence, so I can't judge whether those are strikes that should occur. What I will say is the two things that I think about back in the 1980s when we ramped up the war on drugs and we got very energetic about stopping supply, I don't think we did nearly as much on stopping demand. As long as there is robust demand, it's almost impossible to solve that particular problem at the supply side, particularly with synthetic drugs like fentanyl. And so I can't judge those particular strikes. I will say, however, my experience in the counterterrorism world as well, you don't win a counterterrorist fight by killing people. There are a lot of people that get killed, absolutely. And a certain amount of that is required and happens. But it's a seductive temptation to say we're just going to keep killing people, and then what happens is they'll all be gone. The math doesn't work that way. It regenerates. If you can't focus on the cause of the problem, why are people becoming terrorists, what motivates them, what supports them, and all like that, it's almost mathematically impossible just to kill your way to victory. And so I think that we've got to be careful about any strategy that is a strike-centric strategy. Again, that can be a component of it, but it's got to be balanced with those other efforts.
I know a lot of questions to ask around that. All right, let's without further ado, get into the book On Character, Choices That Define a Life. And I did ask you this at the last talk we had, but I would like you to just take all of us to that day where the President of the United States calls you in to the Oval Office, President Obama, after some comments that you had allegedly made, surfaced in a Rolling Stone article, comments that may have seemed to be disparaging of the Vice President. You're called into the Oval Office. You have a pretty good inclination of what might be coming. Take us blow by blow into that meeting and what was going through your mind.
Sure. I'd been in the Army 34 years at that point as an officer, and 4 years at West Point before that. I'd been in Afghanistan for a year. Before that, I'd been in Iraq for 5 years. And so been gone quite a bit. And the story that came out was by a freelance reporter working for the Rolling Stone. And he depicted my command team as not very mature and locker room-like talk. And I didn't think the article was fair. I didn't think it was accurate. But it came out so fast. And that kind of didn't matter, because there was this perception among some people that there was tension between Defense Department and the new president, President Obama's administration. I don't think that that was as true as the perception was, but that narrative was there. So this story comes out, and as soon as it comes out, I knew how serious it was. So I flew back to the United States with my resignation in my pocket to offer it to President Obama, because it's my responsibility not to put that kind of story on the president's desk. So I go in, well, one short thing, I'm flying back on the plane, it's like 17 hours, and I've got email connectivity on the plane, and I get an email from 3 privates. Now, not many privates email 4-star generals, but I had gone about a month before, and I'd gone on a combat patrol with them. In fact, I'd gone on 2 with them. And I'd gone on the first one with them, and then after that, their squad leader had been killed, so I went back and did it again. So I get this email from these 3 privates, and it said, "Sir, we heard about this article, and if that stuff's true, we don't think that was very smart." And here I am not feeling that good about myself, and I got these 3 privates. And they said, "But sir, we know you, and we love you. Good luck." So we land in D.C. in time for me to put on my dress uniform, go to the White House, go in to see President Obama, with whom I'd always had a good relationship and still do. We come in, and he says, "What happened?" And I said, "I don't know. I mean, I know the story came out. I don't know the back part. Haven't had time to do it. But Mr. President, I brought you my resignation. And if you want me to leave command, leave the Army, I'm okay with that. If you want me to go back in command, I'm okay with that too. Whatever's best for the mission." And he said, "I've decided to accept your resignation." Now you're sitting in the Oval Office, which is a strange experience all the time. But in that particular moment, we stood up, shook hands, and I walked out. When I walked out of the room, I wasn't the commander in Afghanistan anymore. I wasn't a 4-star general. I wasn't even a general. I wasn't even a soldier. And I'd been born in an Army hospital, the son of a soldier, gone into West Point at age 17. My entire being was soldier. And now I walked out, and not only am I not a soldier, but I'm on the ticker of the news every 2 minutes for the next 48 hours. I'm a disgraced former soldier. So if you ever want a moment when you stop and say, "Okay, what am I? What's this is all about? Is it worth it?" A moment like that will cause that. I drove back across Washington, D.C. to where Annie, who at that point we'd been married 34 years, and we've been together 37 years, and she had grown up in the Army as well, where she was. And I go in the front door to the quarters, and she knew that I had flown back all night to go to the president, but she didn't know what the outcome was going to be. So I walked in and I said, "Okay, Annie, it's over. The president had accepted my resignation." And she looked at me and she said, "Good. We've always been happy and we'll always be happy." And what she did in that moment is she set the azimuth for the rest of our life. If she had said, "You know, you weren't treated fairly. You're the aggrieved party," if she pulled me together, I think I would have wallowed in my self-pity and my sense of outrage. And I actually think I would have headed off in that direction for who knows how long. Instead, she just says, "Not having it." The part in the book where we talk about no use for the rear view mirror, because I refer to Annie, I said, she lives life like she drives with no use for the rear view mirror. But thank God for it, because you get a chance several times in your life, we call them inflection points, to make big decisions. And you're usually not prepared to make a big decision. You just make it. And when you make it, if the intuition's right and you go the right direction, it defines almost everything. If you get it wrong, it hurts. And you should correct it as soon as you realize you've done that. But all of us are going to fail. Everyone in here is going to have some failure. A marriage, a job, something. And I would urge you, don't waste it.
It's interesting. You kind of answered my next question, and that is, thanks to your lovely wife, Annie, and not looking in the rearview mirror and living life how your wife drives, I just wonder how powerful the lure of the opposite path is, of bitterness, resentment, revenge. I think you probably have seen colleagues that took that route.
Yeah, we see them, people we know and people we don't know, and it's really easy. And when I say we picked a way and we went that way, you know, you could describe it as the high road or whatever. It's not easy. You are constantly, particularly in the early days, there are times when you don't sleep at night. You're just either so angry or you're so upset or you just think, I'm so embarrassed. Because that was the overriding thing. I was humiliated to leave command that way. And I felt like I'd let down all the people who were serving with me. I just suddenly disappeared from Afghanistan, and I write handwritten notes to a bunch of them, but I just deserted my post. And it's hard, but it gets easier over time. It's almost like every day it gets a little easier. And then one of the things you learn is I would walk through airports and I'd see somebody a little ways away and somebody would kind of point at me and they'd whisper to somebody else, and I assume they're saying something derogatory about me. And yet, when I engaged people, that was never the case. And then pretty soon after that, when I talked to people, they didn't bring it up. And I said, how could they not bring it up? This is a big deal. Well, the world moves on pretty darn quickly. What is so important to you isn't that important to everybody else. They may listen politely if you sort of tell them your sob story, but they really want to talk about something else. And that's a good thing.
On character, and when you talk about the virtues and the actions that define character, was the impetus for this as the organizing principle for your book the perhaps lack of character that we see in our public life right now on many levels, but especially in our politics? It seems like character is shoved aside for, let's say, spectacle or for advancement.
Yeah, I mean, the organizing principle of this book came late in the process. I wasn't going to write a book. I was done. I wasn't going to write when I first got out of the military because I was embarrassed I wasn't going to write. And they came to me and they said, you got to write your memoirs. And I said, I don't have to write anything. And they said, you have a debt to history. I said, I don't have a debt to anybody. They say, we'll pay you a lot of money. All right. So that was book one. Then I liked that process and we wrote 3 other books, but then I was done. And then Annie and I like to sit in our living room and read. And about every 15 or 20 minutes, I'll interrupt her and I'll say, Annie, do you know what I think about this great issue in life? And she'd look at me and she'd kind of nod for a little while and then she'd go back to reading. Then finally one day she says, why don't you write this stuff down? To stop me from interrupting her. So I started writing these little essays just on completely random things that I just had opinions on or I was thinking about. And so the first title of this book was going to be What I Think About the Things I Think About. I thought it was brilliant. She slam dunked it. The publisher slam dunked it. But the point was, I didn't know the book was about character until most of the essays were done. And then I realized what I'd been thinking about, what I'd been obsessing for the last 15 years about, all intersects with character in some way. And that was always the most important thing. The thing about character is my parents were extraordinary examples. As I tell people, I never saw either of them do anything wrong, ever. But they never talked about character. They didn't sit me down and say, this is what it takes to be a good person. They just did it. And then I went to West Point, and they were a little more overt. They've got statues and paintings, and they beat you over the head with character, but that's a good thing. But then you get in your job, you want to be a soldier, whatever you are, and you work hard, and life gets complicated, and you don't spend a lot of time talking about character. But when you look back at all the important moments of life and the relationships, it was the important thing. And if we say, what is character? It's the essence of who we are. But it's reflected in what we do, not what we say or what we write. It's reflected in your behavior. And when Ryan referred to the fact that I came up with this equation, I'm jumping ahead, I know. Sorry about that. Character is convictions times discipline. What I'm saying is we all have convictions. Those are things that we feel very strongly about, not little superficial beliefs, but things we've pressure tested that we're willing to live to or die for. But the other part of the equation, it's times our discipline to live to them. Because think how many times someone purports to have wonderful convictions, and then in moments of stress or opportunity, they do completely different. Well, they've just revealed their real character. And sometimes they reveal it to themselves. Sometimes you don't even know it about yourself until you're in that moment and you see what you do. And then you've identified what it is. Tom Paine, the old pamphleteer, said, reputation is what men think of us. Character is what gods and angels know of us. So it is, in my view, kind of the only thing that matters. And it should be the thing that matters most to us about us. But I think it should be what matters to us about other people. Who we love, who we support, who we vote for, you name it. All of those things ought to have character as a significant component.
I was going to say, I had this aha moment because you organized the book. You have all your essays, but 3 parts: the conviction and discipline. Oh, it's a math equation. It's like 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. Ingeniously simple equation here. So speaking of conviction, so conviction is the bedrock here. To command the forces that you commanded, you had to have deep conviction. Did you always, let's say, commanding the coalition forces in Afghanistan, did you always have that deep conviction that was necessary to lead the coalition?
Yeah, I think the answer is, I think I did. On 2 levels, though. There is first a conviction about what's right and wrong. How should we conduct ourselves? How should this force operate? All of these other things. And what my role was, what my responsibilities were, both as a soldier and then in the position that I held. So that conviction is sort of the bedrock. Then there's the conviction, can we win this thing? And that's an interesting paradox, because I don't know if you all ever grew up playing baseball or similar sport. I pitched in baseball. And late in the game, if you're tired and you're not doing that well, and the coach comes to the mound and he says, how you doing? The answer is, I'm good. I can keep going. Because if the pitcher goes, no, I really don't want him on my team. Similar with a military leader. You get a job as difficult as we see leaders often get. If I get in front of the force and I go, okay, this Afghanistan thing's really hard. Guys, I need you to do this. And I give us about, 40% chance of winning. Those soldiers are going, what? You have to believe. And this is one of the key things. So when you go testify in front of Congress, you have to, if you're a 3 or 4 star, you have to sign a statement that says, I will give my personal beliefs. I will not simply just reflect the beliefs of the administration. So they're making you vow to be honest. But at the same time, most of the mature people in Congress, they know if they ask the commander in Afghanistan, can you get this job done? that that leader almost has to believe to have any possibility of happening. Because once that leader thinks it's not possible, it is now impossible. But there are other people, you've got to triangulate too. Just like the coach at the mound for the pitcher goes, well, you've done really well so far, but we're going to replace you now. And so the ability to have conviction, sometimes we have convictions about things that are unrealistic. And that's not all bad.
Another essay that's always popped out to me, A Matter of Perspective. You write about the importance of understanding your quote-unquote enemies, understanding people with different perspectives. You write about the Pashtun elders that you sat with in Afghanistan, and how, democracy wasn't necessarily on their minds, and folks here in the United States couldn't really quite comprehend that. But you could, if you had grown up in the situation that they had. You could for sure understand where they're coming from, or even Al-Qaeda terrorists attempting to understand what path that they went on to bring them where they are. How does that weigh into your decisions as a commander and as a leader, especially when you're commanding forces that have to kill?
Yeah, we want to dehumanize the enemy because it makes it easier to kill them. Bull Halsey, during the Second World War, at the entrance to one of the harbors in the Pacific, had a huge billboard made that said, "Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs." Now, decades later, that seems sort of almost offensive. In the context of that moment, it wasn't. In the context of what he was trying to do and the force he was dealing with and what the United States had just gone through, it was sort of understandable. What Paris referred to, on the Pashtun elders, Senator Levin came out, and if those of you remember Senator Levin, he was a lawyer and he was, very detail-oriented, and I'd known him for a while. But he came to Afghanistan after the election when President Karzai won, and there were allegations of corruption. Go figure. So we went down to this remote part of Helmand province, and we go to a village, and Senator Levin had done his homework, and we're in a room that's a hard floor, kind of low-ceilinged mud place with about 50 guys in there, all really craggy-looking faces. They'd had a tough life, big turbans, serious-looking people. And Senator Levin, through the interpreter, goes, "Okay, I looked at the results from this district, and President Karzai got all the votes. How is that democracy?" The guy interpreted it, and they start talking among themselves. I figure we're dead. And then one of the guys stands up through the interpreter, and he says, "We talked about it. We talked about what our options were, how democracy works, and we decided it wouldn't make any point in splitting our vote. So we came to a decision, and then once we came to a decision, we all voted. How is that not democracy?" And it was a different perspective, and it wasn't wrong. And what Paris also referred to as when Paul LeCamera and I were together in JSOC, people would come visit, and they'd go, you guys are the good guys, and your best commandos are these wonderful people, and we're fighting against this depiction of evil at the other end with Al-Qaeda operatives. And I used to take the drawing on the whiteboard, and I would curve it up to the top so that two arrows met very close to each other. And I said, the thing is, the best people from SEAL Team 6, from Delta Force, from the Rangers, are almost exactly alike the best people from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Dedicated, loyal, courageous. They just had a different life journey. And so they arrived at a very predictable place. And I'm honest enough to think that if my life journey had been different, I'd end up in some very different place. So when the matter of perspective comes out, it makes you much more cautious about thinking we're right and they're wrong. Because it's a matter of perspective.
And kind of on that strain, I want to read a quote. I can't remember which chapter this is from, but quote, "War, we know from history," maybe it's the quote on war. "War, we know from history, rarely solves a problem it was initiated to address. Soon the hostilities begin as blood is shed and friends are killed. The fight reorients itself into a brutal struggle that is more about the fight itself than the original cause. In the aftermath, we rightly question the wisdom of it all." Considering how Afghanistan ended in the aftermath, did you undergo that kind of questioning, the wisdom of it all?
Yeah, you certainly do. I think my personal calculation is the effort in Afghanistan was well-intended, and it was tried to do the right thing, to give the Afghan people the opportunity to have sovereignty for their country. And we didn't do it as well as we could have. And they didn't do it as well as they could have. The Afghan people deserve huge credit for the failure as well. But I don't think it was a misplaced effort. A friend of mine, a retired British officer, wonderful guy, he answers the question slightly differently, but it's compelling to me. When soldiers ask him, "Sir, was it worth it?" He says, "Don't ask yourself that. Ask yourself, did I do my duty? And if I did my duty the best I could, don't feel sad, guilty. Take satisfaction, because that's your responsibility." Other people with policy should and will make big decisions. You do your duty as best you can, and then have no regrets.
And you mentioned that thinking about politics is not something that you did. Talk about it with your peers. But now you have had some time to reflect on our country's politics, because all of this is intertwined. The decisions that we make on the world stage have a lot to do with the politics that we experience here at home. You do offer perspectives in your book on how to fix our country's broken politics. These are pretty, I would say, I think everyone would agree that these are pretty common sense, agreeable ideas. So I was wondering if you could share them with everybody.
Sure. First off is, I am not hugely political, either liberal or conservative. In fact, I'm in the middle on most things, a little on one and a little on another. But I can't stand systems that don't work. Drives me crazy, because the great weakness in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan is the systems don't work. And when the system doesn't work, you get a corrupted outcome, no matter how good the people or the resources you put in are. Now, our system was designed, if we look at our Constitution or we read the Federalist Papers, it was designed under the expectation that people are not perfect. It was designed to limit powers. It was designed to have checks and balances. It was designed to have a House of Representatives that is 2-year terms, that's more emotional, that's more connected to the people, and have a more august Senate, which operates more slowly and doesn't have to run for office as much, to balance passions with longer-term wisdom. So it built a lot of mechanisms that have served pretty well. And I would argue what we've done is we've allowed those mechanisms to cease to work as well as we need them to. For example, I think what has happened is people in Congress right now, partly because of the way media covers and they act, they can't compromise because they're punished politically for that. Our primary system almost guarantees that if they compromise, they will be punished and likely removed from office. So they don't. So is that a surprise? So we have to address the primary system, because we will keep getting that result. We'll always be pulled toward extremes on either side. We are about stimulating the vote. 65% of eligible American voters voted in the last presidential election. The two leading candidates both got less than 50% of the vote because there was a third-party candidate, which means that we elected a president with less than half of 65%. So we're down about 31, 32%. I would simply make voting mandatory. Australia does it. Everyone would have to vote. Now, you would have the option to say, I choose nobody, but you wouldn't have the opportunity not to vote. And what that would do is immediately stop voter suppression. It would immediately stop the big stimulant, get people energized to go vote, because you got to vote. I would go after the money in politics in a massive way, because these political figures now have got to spend most of their time raising money, because if you don't, you can't stay in office, which means that you've got to raise this ungodly amount of money time after time, which makes you beholden to special interests. If anybody in here is really rich, I'd like to hang out with you, but you have more political power than the rest of us. We can say, thus has it always been. Yeah, but it shouldn't be that way. You shouldn't have people with disproportionate wealth having disproportionate political influence. I would force Congress to stay in D.C. on weekends. First thing I'd do is I'd have a meeting, I'd have a session at noon on Saturday for 5 minutes that they had to be present for. And I would cut off the pay where they are reimbursed for their travel to go home. They would actually probably appreciate the fact that they could stay. But right now, they don't socialize with each other. They don't ever see each other, because Congress is only there from Tuesday through Thursday. You probably know that. They run the country 3 days a week because they have to go home to tend to things, so they're not primaried. And I wouldn't let any member of Congress campaign against another member of Congress. And you say, well, that's taking away their freedom of speech. The reason I got this, and I got this from a friend of mine, Joe Manchin, it is based upon the idea, once you've run against a colleague, you're never going to be able to cooperate as well as you did before that. It just creates a dynamic. And so I think there are a number of things that we could do that are focused on the system, because we get good people going in the system, and I would argue it's really hard to retain the idealism and the values that you have going in and surviving it.
General McChrystal, there's so many questions I still have, but I do think we have time for audience questions, do we not? So I think there will be a mic that comes around. If anyone, just throw your hands up in the air, and we'll get the mic to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this, both of you. Do you read any of your peers, advanced former flag officers in the military, either Admiral Stavridis or Admiral McRaven? And who do you like?
I mean, truth be known, I do like them all. Well, Navy guys, it's hard to like, but no. What you find is when you work together, particularly at that level, there's stresses, but you develop an awful lot of rapport and whatnot. And we still talk and we still interact. And I think there's some incredibly talented, great Americans like Bill McRaven, like Jim Stavridis, Jim Mattis, Dave Petraeus. I mean, there's some extraordinary talent doing some good things, but they are critical for the nation as well. Thanks.
Sir, how are you? Thanks for coming. I heard everything. The last question of the principles, how are they enforceable? How do you make these guys or gals do this? And my follow-up is, do you think the 24-hour news cycle has anything to do on what these congressmen and senators are doing?
Yeah, the question is, how do you actually get things like this done? Most of the things I talked about would take legislation to do, which makes it really hard for them to do it. And so I'm not holding my breath. I think the 24-hour news cycle amps everything up, because what we find is the 24-hour news cycle, if you communicate enough, a month later you can say something completely different. And people will look at the camera and they'll go, yeah, I know I said it was 1 last month. Now I think it's 3. And we don't hold anybody accountable for that. It's curious to me. people have changed positions, and everybody should change their position if they get new information, if they thought through something. But some of the changes we see are simply stunning. And the term I use for that is opportunism. You know, people say, well, the wind's blowing this way, so I will blow that way. I want our leaders to be flexible enough to change where important, realistic enough to compromise, but I want them rooted in some values. Some things have to be moored and not be movable. You know, your integrity, your requirement for respect for other Americans. And I think that we have made all of that in play, exacerbated by the fact that media helps with that.
And I apologize for that. Gerrymandering was another, I think, important cornerstone in there, which the country is not going in the direction that you would prefer it to right now on that issue.
No, gerrymandering is unfortunate because, you know, what you do is you prevent the political process from working as we envisioned. And so gerrymandering, you know, it's not new. But the reality is, particularly when we do it in the middle of a cycle like it's being done right now, it's like an arms race. It's suddenly someone says, we're going to limit the number of nukes we made, and somebody says, I'm going to start making more nukes. The other side feels they have to. And pretty soon we get into this really destructive process and cycle. And I'm really saddened to see that right now. I don't have a better solution in this particular moment, but I'm saddened by it.
Our next question over here.
Over.
Thank you so much, General McChrystal, for coming here today. My name is Janice Dale, and I serve on the Public Affairs Committee here. And in that capacity, I am working on civic education, particularly for adults. And in that context, I wonder if you could talk about your work with Service Year Alliance and the idea of national service, and whether or not there's a way to make the idea of national service, which is typically pitched to young people, if there's a way for that to be translated to adults, such as members of this club. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for that question. You sort of press the button now. You're going to get my deeply held beliefs here. I never thought about national service when I was in the military. When I got out, I did an event where someone asked me if we should have a military draft, and I answered, yes, I think we should, so that it's equitable. But I really think every young American should serve. And you don't want everybody in the military because it's not big enough. You need people in healthcare, law enforcement, conservation, any number of things. But my real reason for that is if we think about how we learn things, sometimes we learn it from school. Usually we learn it from example or experience. Most of the people in here who served in the military will admit that they are different now than they were before they went in. I fold my underwear in my drawer still. Come check. Because I just think you should. But there are a lot of good habits that come from sometimes being coerced and shaped into that. And I think that if we gave every young American a chance to do a year of paid national service, I say paid stipend, because you don't want it limited to people whose families can support them. You want everybody to be able to do it. You want them to serve with people from other zip codes, from other backgrounds, from other perspectives, and you want them to do something that they may not do ever again in their life. But for a period, they are doing something for other Americans. They become stockholders in the nation in a way. They have crossed a line. They're not just recipients of all America has to give. They have given. And if we make that experience worthwhile, not necessarily pleasant or easy, but worthwhile, they're going to get a sense of satisfaction that will change how they think about their responsibility as citizens for the rest of their lives. Now, I've told people, to every political leader I can think of. I was chairman of the Service Year Alliance for more than a decade. Now I'm chairman emeritus, still involved. I've spoken to college presidents, business leaders, and everybody's for it. but we won't do anything. It takes some money, it takes some decisions to do this kind of stuff. I actually think that if a presidential candidate embraces this and gets up and says, it's not political, it's not partisan at all, we are going to give every young American this opportunity. You don't even have to make it mandatory. If you do it energetically and make it culturally expected so that it's this opportunity that everybody can do, the next time a young person wants to run for Congress, they're not going to want to get up in front of people, and when a journalist says, so where did you serve? They're not going to want to go, They're going to want to go, I taught in the 7th Ward in New Orleans. I did trails and so on, whatever. And I think that expectation would start to heal some divides across the country too. If you go to Israel, they will argue about everything. But they all start with, what unit did you serve in? Because the vast majority served, and it gives them a common sinew that is invaluable.
Next question over here.
General, thank you for coming here today. For me personally, it means a lot to me because the way that you're talking about our broken political system and coming out with corrupt outcomes, I'm currently going through that myself. So I was recruited and trained by a veterans PAC to run for office, and the guidance they gave you is much of what you said. You raise as much money as possible and then spend it on ads, get the name recognition, and then the cycle continues. And so I actually rejected that. And I decided to try and run a different style of campaign. And I'm now running for the United States Senate here in Illinois as Senator Durbin is retiring. And my question for you, in having the character to reject the practices that result in corrupt outcomes, what advice do you have for someone like me going against that system when it's designed to keep people like me out? Thank you.
Yeah, well, first, good luck in your effort, and I appreciate that good young people are willing to go into this gauntlet. I really do, because it's tough to do. Go back and read Barack Obama's first book. He talks about when he ran for office, and he said, okay, I'm not going to take money from big groups. And so he went to friends and family. He said, well, that wasn't very much money. I need to go get some more money. And he went to some other groups. And then he started being connected with very wealthy people. And he said, two things happen. He says, first, that's where the money is. And second, they're smart, charming people. And it's not that anybody's trying to seduce anybody, but it starts that process. It starts the reality that you are going to have interests and people who have some kind of control, maybe too strong a word initially, but certainly influence. And so the answer is, I don't have a proof solution. I think that the first thing is you've got to decide what kind of leader you're going to be, and you've got to set some real limits for yourself. And if those limits cost you the victory, or once you're in office, they cost you re-election, if you don't have those and they continue to slide, then I think you'll be disappointed later. But this is what's so hard about character. It's easy for us to sit here and say about character, you know, I'm not going to do X. I mean, for example, I have never accepted a bribe in my life, which is impressive. I've never been offered a bribe. So we don't know yet, right? But no, you start to get into that. And so I would do a lot of soul searching to decide where your limits are. And they don't have to be, you don't have to be extraordinarily corseted. You don't have to be, you know, a Puritan or in any way. But you do have to have some. And if you don't have them, then you will be representative of something that you don't want to be, in my view. Thanks and good luck.
We have our next question back here in the corner on this side.
Thank you for coming here today, General. Appreciate it very much. I've got a question I've been struggling to answer for many years now. So I was in Nam. I was there 71, 72 with MR2. Before I went there, my teacher was Henry Kissinger. So I've been struggling, trying to figure out for a long time how to answer a simple question. You've answered it as to Iraq, Afghanistan, and what is the wisdom now that we're teaching at West Point, and what personally are you teaching when you're asked the question of what have we learned from Nam?
From Vietnam. Yeah.
Yeah.
My father and brother in Vietnam, my brother was there the year you were. Here's what I think we learned, and there are several lessons here. The first is we learned the limits of power and the fact that we had extraordinary technology. We expended a tremendous amount of national treasure. We lost 58,000 Americans, and we learned that there was only so much you can do when there are conditions in a country such as they were. So that's sort of the most obvious thing. The second thing I think we learned is we talk about asymmetric warfare. That's a modern term, and it usually refers to people fight differently. One side fights one way. I use it differently. I talk about asymmetric commitment. In the Vietnam War, we developed a strategy that said we would increase the pressure on the enemy, North Vietnam in this case, which was supporting the insurgency in the South. We would increase the pressure, almost like a rheostat, escalation, until we reached a point of pressure on them and pain where they would quit. What we didn't appreciate is they didn't have that point. There was no point at which they would quit, because that's where they were. They were asymmetrically committed. And I think sometimes we have to have that appreciation for something is important to us and we're very powerful, but the other side's prepared to fight forever. Ukraine and Russia, we may see this play out here as we go forward. The last one for Vietnam is, and we were guilty of it in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in a slightly different way. When Americans go somewhere, we are often culturally blind, deaf, and dumb. We don't speak the language. We don't know the history. We haven't established long familiarity with what we're doing. And so as a consequence, it makes it extraordinarily difficult to put into context the kinds of decisions that you make. And for example, in places like Afghanistan, we would go in and we'd be in a hurry to do things. So we would find the local leader who could provide workers or construction, and we would hire that person because they also spoke English, so that was great. And we would ignore the fact that in many cases, when we hired that person, we were in fact disadvantaging people from other tribes in the same area, and we were creating a dynamic that we couldn't see or feel because we just didn't have that immersion. And it wasn't because we were ill-intended, it was because we were ignorant. And so I think having the humility to understand before you start doing something as important as intervening and dealing, you've got to make as much effort as humanly possible to understand what you're operating in. What is the opportunity or possibility of success and what you'd have to do to achieve that? Thanks, sir.
And our final question.
Thank you. General, thank you for being here. As an Army enlisted soldier, it's an honor to hear your thoughts. One quick thought, it does relate back to current events. Given your perch and your perspective and your experience, in 2028, we face an election that could not be accepted for what it is. From your vantage point, does the chain of command have guardrails in place to prevent a military coup if that's the case?
Boy, that's almost an unanswerable question because it goes on so many levels. The fact that you could ask that question and we would all take it seriously is horrifying. We shouldn't have to have that discussion. You don't ever want the military in a position where they are saying, to save our democracy, we've got to temporarily take it over. mean, that's what happens in Pakistan every 20 years. But it is pretty easy for that kind of a mindset to sink in, where you suddenly have one side that says we've got to go outside the Constitution, outside our values to protect it. And very rarely does that have a good outcome. On the other hand, if we are in a position where we think we cannot have a legitimate election, what are the other options? I mean, this is where the American people have got to, in their energy, in their wisdom, in everything they do, they have got to focus on protecting that thing. And it doesn't matter whether they're looking for Republicans or Democrats or somebody else to win it. If we can't rise up and produce a legitimate presidential election in 2028, then I think we will have big problems. I think we can do it, but I don't take anything for granted anymore. And it doesn't just take a few people in D.C., it takes people in rooms like this all over the country to do it. Thanks for the question.
And with that, we will wrap up the Q&A. Paris, any?
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, General McChrystal. Thank you all. It's an honor to be in here with you. Thank you all for your service. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good to see you again.